While Biafra was threatening to secede and declare an independent state, the Gowon-led government imposed sanctions against her to bring the eastern region into line. On 26 May, the Eastern Region Consultative Assembly voted to secede from Nigeria, and the following day, Gowon declared a state of emergency throughout the country, banned political activity, and announced a decree restoring full powers to the Gowon-led government. Also, he announced a decree dividing the country into 12 states, including 6 in the north and 3 in the east. On 30th May 1967, Biafra declared independence, and on 7th July, the Gowon-led government began operations to defeat it. It lasted until January 1970 as an extremely well-equipped Nigerian Federal Army of over 250,000 men supplied by Britain, the Soviet Union, and few others took on a volunteer Biafran army, much of whose equipment initially came from captured Nigerian supplies and which only later was able to procure relatively small quantities of arms from outside. The background is therefore very complex, and it remains far from clear-cut as to where the blame lay for the failure of peaceful negotiations and the resort to war. It does appear, however, that the Gowon-led government did go back on its agreement at Aburi on the extent of regional autonomy it was prepared to offer the Easterners. Before they began to back the Gowon-led government unequivocally once the war began, British officials had previously recognized the legitimacy of some of Ojukwu's claims. The High British Commissioner in Lagos, Sir Francis Comyn Bruce, had told Gowon in November 1966, for example, that the September 1966 massacres of the Igbos in the north changed the relationship between the regions and made it impossible for Eastern Nigerians to associate with Northerners on the same basis as in the past. The issue was one of basic law and order and physical safety throughout the Federation. He told Gowon that the Gowon-led government had to go a considerable distance to meet the views of Colonel Ojukwu. British officials also recognized that the Aburi agreements were extremely woolly on many important points and lent themselves to infinite arguments over interpretation. By end January 1967, Comyn Bruce was saying that both Gowon and Ojukwu were seriously at fault and they share responsibility for the poisoning of atmosphere. Then there was the wider question of whether it was legitimate for a region to secede and whether Biafra should have been allowed to establish its independence. Again, a lot of complex issues are involved. British officials feared that if Biafra were to secede, many other regions in Africa would too, threatening stability across the whole of the continent. Most of the great powers, including the US and Soviet Union, shared this view largely for the same reason. Yet, there appears to be no reason why Biafra, with her 15 million people, could not have established a viable, independent state. Biafrans argued that they were a people with a distinctive language and culture, that they were Christian as opposed to the Muslim communities lumped into the Nigeria federal state, which had, after all, been a colonial creation. In fact, Biafra was also one of the most developed regions in Africa, with a high density of roads, schools, hospitals, and factories. The struggle for an independent state certainly appeared to have the support of the majority of Biafrans, whose sense of nationhood deepened throughout the war as enormous sacrifices were made to contribute to the war effort. British interests in the war were apparent and in favor of Gowon-led military government. Shell BP's investments amounted to around £200 million, with other British investments in Nigeria accounting for a further £90 million. It was then partly owned by the British government and the largest producer of oil, which provided most of Nigeria's export earnings. Most of this oil was in the eastern region. Commonwealth Minister George Thomas wrote in August 1967 that the sole immediate British interest in Nigeria is that the Nigerian economy should be brought back to a condition in which our substantial trade and investment in the country can be further developed, and particularly so we can regain access to important oil installations. Thomas further outlined the primary reason why Britain was so keen to preserve Nigerian unity, noting that, and I quote, our only direct interest in the maintenance of the Federation is that Nigeria has been developed as an economic unit, and any disruption of this would have adverse effects on trade and development. If Nigeria were to break up, he added, we cannot expect that economic cooperation between the component parts of what was Nigeria, particularly between the East and the West, will necessarily enable development and trade to proceed at the same level as they would have done in a unified Nigeria. Nor can we now count on the Shell BP oil concession being regained on the same terms as in the past, if the East and the Midwest assume full control of their own economies. Ojukwu initially tried to get Shell BP to pay royalties to the Biafran government rather than the Gowon-led government. The oil companies, after giving the Biafrans a small token payment, eventually refused, and Ojukwu responded by sequestering Shell's property and installations, forbidding Shell to do any further business and ordering all its staff out. They have much to lose if the Gowon-led government does not achieve the expected victory, George Thomas noted in August 1967. A key British aim throughout the war was to secure the lifting of the blockade which Gowon imposed on the East and which stopped oil exports. By the time Gowon ordered military action in early July, therefore, Britain had refused Nigerian requests to be militarily involved and had urged Gowon to seek a peaceful solution. However, the Wilson government had also assured Gowon of British support for Nigerian unity at a time when military preparations were taking place. And Britain had also made no signs that she might cut off or reduce arms supplies if a military campaign were launched. The new High Commissioner in Lagos, Sir David Hunt, wrote in a memo to London on 12th June that the only way of preserving the unity of Nigeria is to remove Ojukwu by force. He said that Ojukwu was committed to remaining the ruler of an independent state and that British interest lay in firmly supporting the Gowon-led government.